Welcome back, amigas. So glad you're joining us again. This is Sophia.
This is Sonia.
And this is Gabby.
We are Señora Power. Y si tu reacción a eso es what? Check out episode 1 to catch up on who we are and what we're up to.
A ti te dedico mis versos, mi ser, mis victorias. A ti mi respeto, señora, señora, señora.
This episode is dedicated especially to those of us introverts with social anxiety, but also to all of our extroverted friends who keep inviting us to parties. Today, we'll be talking about a most glamorous, popular, and influential kind of señora, social señoras. These are señoras who never miss a party or the chance to organize one. And in the booming Houston metropolis of the 1940s and 50s, being a Mexican-American socialite was a big responsibility. So before we go on with this episode, are there any señoras in y'all's life who come to mind or who fit the description of a social señora?
Definitely.
I love this intro. It's so funny. It's great. And definitely, I felt like my mom was definitely a social señora. She was always the one who would, I feel like these kind of señoras are a little bit like snoopy as well, like nosy. And so she was always like snooping around like the neighbors' houses and they'd be like, hello, do you want to come in? She's like, yeah. And then make friends for life.
That's
great.
amazing. I think that I know señoras who are like kind of the social club vibe señoras, that love to be around people, but also like love to know things about people. And I think that yeah, I think that's kind of a different little subsection of social señoras, or it's like part of social señoras. So I think I definitely know social señoras who love to know information about other people.
There definitely is a spectrum of social señoras. They can be they can have multiple kinds of roles within the category of a social señora. I think my mom is definitely a social señora as well. She's been meeting with her amigas from like elementary school every Thursday for the last I
Wow.
don't know how many years. So and
That
she
is
never misses
dedication.
it.
That is
I just feel
dedication.
like, we don't have to get into it too much, but there's something about being a mom, maybe, that like
Hmm.
demands a level of socializing.
Yeah.
That like all of the mom like figures in her life are like that.
Yeah, yeah. A lot of planning goes behind being a social señora, is what I hear.
Mm.
And therefore, I feel like I could never be a social señora. RIP, my social life.
You
It
do
is
gotta be
hard.
like super okay with like asking people to do things and then just like finding the space, finding the time. You gotta like, it's like wrangling cats sometimes.
It definitely is. The hosting gene was not passed down to me, although I do try my very best. I do love my friends.
Well, lucky for you, Gabby. I think that the señora that we're going to be talking about today sort of shows us how you don't entirely need to have that party throwing gene, social gene to to still be able to form and shape a community around you. But I take your point, and I think that we're going to find a lot of resonance with Señora Carmen Cortes's story today, in terms of like finding a community of señoras well into like your 30s and like once you're already a mom and a working woman, et cetera, et cetera. So without further ado, let me get into the story of first and foremost, Señorita Carmen Garza, who was born in San Antonio in 1913 and later moved to Houston sometime in the 20s, although we're not entirely sure what exact year she got to Houston. Later on, she became Señora Carmen Cortes in 1933 when she married Melesio Cortes, who owned a produce store in Magnolia Park. Señora Carmen is an important figure in Houston's Mexican-American history because in 1940, she became the first person of Hispanic descent to work a quote-unquote white-collar job in the Harris County offices. She was a secretary for a judge. In 1955, she began a long-term commitment as a national secretary for LULAC, the League of United Latin American Citizens, and her political involvement continued as a member of LULAC's Ladies Council number 22 until the late 60s. So it's a pretty extensive resume, Pero how did she do it? So y'all picture this. You're a señora in the 1940s looking for a job. You don't have much work experience, no higher ed degrees, since these are, not available for your community yet. But you are a mom, as we were saying earlier, and you're active in your community. So what do you think is the number one resource that you have going on for you during this time?
I mean, definitely your connections. You are who you know, I guess, like really plays into this.
Yeah, I mean, I think your number one resources are always kind of who you know. Like that ends up being something I think historically true. And for señoras in this time, like you were saying, Sophia, there are some limitations to the spaces you can occupy and to the type of people that you see in certain jobs. But I think Carmen was kind of exemplary in that idea of like, well, I'm going to provide for my family, or I'm going to be in the best space that I can possibly be. So I'm going to be the first, Hispanic woman secretary of a judge, right? For example, in Houston. And I know that reading and listening to a lot of oral histories of señoras, especially in Houston, there was this idea of quote unquote white collar jobs as being great because they were jobs that were in an air conditioned setting where you didn't have to expend a lot of physical labor. And that I think is like a respectable goal. And I think that, if you look at Carmen's career in life, she achieved a great deal in terms of what maybe people in her community were aspiring to. So she clearly activated her network of people she knew, and also maybe her know-how about how people worked.
Yeah. I mean, I think we take it for granted a little bit, like letters of recommendation or references. But I imagine, as Gabby's saying, like when you're applying to work for a judge, you have to have people who can sort of like attest to your character, which she was very good at doing, it seems.
Yeah, no, this is such a good point. And I feel like I don't think there was ever a moment when Señorita Carmen was like, oh my God, I'm going to be the first Hispanic person to like hold this kind of job. But it was rather like, this is the kind of thing that I want to aspire to. And I have a community that can sort of help me get there. So just to tell you a little bit more about Señora Carmen's background and how she came to be like an esteemed member of the Houston community, right? She had a big role in shaping this community, actually. And I'm not even talking about LULAC. Today, we're actually talking about the 1930s, the less glamorous and financially unstable cousin of the Roaring 20s. Because who better than Mexicans to throw a carne asada on a budget, right? And of course, Señora Carmen was not organizing the kinds of rascuache backyard parties that we like to throw, but rather she was one of the founding members of two very stylish social clubs, Club Chapultepec, in which she participated as a señorita before being married, and Club Femenino Mexico Bello as one of the Señora organizers. So here's some background about these clubs. Club Chapultepec was established in 1931 by many women, including Estela Gomez, Eva Perez, and Carmen Garza, later Cortes. The idea for a social club emerged during a meeting of another club, Club Social Deportivo Femenino, where it was suggested that, quote unquote, las jóvenes conocidas, aka the popular girls of Magnolia Park, needed a place to get together to play sports and organize social functions. At least that's how it was described in a 1931 newspaper article titled Un nuevo club femenino habrá en la Asociación Cristiana de Mujeres. In another newspaper article titled Mexican Girl Clubs Teach Citizenship, the purpose of the club is described as teaching Mexican girls to become better citizens, to take a greater interest in athletics and social activities, and to better themselves both mentally and physically, end quote. Finally, and I guess most importantly, in the handwritten history of Club Chapultepec, one of the founders, Estela Gomez, writes that the club was intended to be a supplement for women attending business school and seeking jobs as bookkeepers, typists, and sales associates. So to this end, Chapultepec would meet in the YWCA downtown on Main Street, at the time the only Young Women's Christian Association branch in the Houston area, which was close to the business schools and the kinds of jobs that these women were applying for. So besides being a member, Carmen also served as treasurer for Club Chapultepec from 1936 to 1937, putting to practice those clerical skills that she was learning in school, right? So before we move on to Señora Carmen's many other club engagements, why do you think that there were so many clubs around during this time? The clubs were so popular during the 40s and 50s.
I think that's a great question because I think it really speaks to trying to find community after turmoil. Personally, I think historically, if you look at the area of the world that is United States and Mexico, in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, there was a lot of turmoil. So 20s is post World War I, which hit the US really hard, but then it also was the Mexican Revolution, which created a kind of refugee situation from Mexico to the United States. A lot of our señoras' lives testify to that because they came to the US fleeing the Mexican Revolution and its after effects. In the 30s, then you find the Great Depression, economic depression, which a lot of señoras migrated into. And then after that, the draft for World War II, which a lot of señoras were also affected by. Their sons and husbands, brothers were all drafted, even if they weren't naturalized citizens, right? And we know this happens even to today. So I think that all of that like landscape of turmoil creates a need to solidify what kind of relationships and networks you have socially, which then translates to resources, like we were saying, like tangible resources. I think you can even draw a parallel to like current events. After lockdown and after people came out of quarantine, there was this huge surge, at least that I saw in my circles, of book clubs or hiking clubs here in LA. That's really popular. Even crafting, knitting, art spaces of people of color, like all of these things. I used to go to a workshop where there was printing classes, and the two people who started it because they were art teachers during the pandemic. And they were saying, we hated teaching art over Zoom, but we wanted to start our own space that was safe from COVID, and where like-minded people in art could come together. They hold a lot of queer art spaces in their space. So I think that that's something that we can identify with now, is even despite all the turmoil, you want to come together and see people. And you want to know who your community is, and you want to know who you can count on if things go poorly, or even if you just need like a reference or a job, if you just need to know what's going on. Because I think when crisis happens, you feel really separated.
Yeah, I think to add on to that, I remember when we looked at some of the archives for these social señoras, I read that Club Chapultepec was a place away from men for the señoritas, at the same time that it was helping construct wives, or like people would graduate in a way from Club Chapultepec when they married. So it was primarily made up of unmarried women. And so I think that it's a way of creating a space to form an identity in the midst of, as Gabby's pointing out, all this turmoil. And I think there's something really, like, I can imagine a paper being written here about that gap in between World War I and World War II, where like jobs, there wasn't exactly a job gap, which is like what happened with World War II that women filled, but there was like, I wonder if the word that keeps coming to mind for me is ambition. It feels like these señoras are a little ambitious because they want to become better citizens, right? Which we can break down what that means. Because they want to have like a greater interest in athletics and social activities to better themselves, right? Like there's something ambitious about that, and that like attention to seeking jobs and to like entering into spaces that Hispanic women hadn't been in before. That feels different than our other señoras. And these spaces, I think, were places where an identity could be constructed with like-minded people, as you're saying. I love the Las Jóvenes Conocidas also. It's like very, it's giving Regina George.
It definitely is for the, well, not the mean girls, but like las jóvenes conocidas, they're the popular girls. They're the people who have like potential, right?
Mm.
Who are kind of like in a way in the spotlight and allowed to have that kind of ambition precisely because they are in the spotlight, right? Like,
Mhm.
well, we know you, we know who you are, we want you to do great things for your community or something like that, right?
Mhm.
I think the gendered aspect is important here in terms of like forming self-identity. It's not just a club for Mexican American women, it's a club for Mexican American women. Like there's like all of these other clubs that are exclusively for men, right? And all of these clubs are like helping men become like, better citizens too. So let me go into the other club that Señora Carmen was a part of, because this one really gets at the identity that men were trying to construct and how women's identity or Señora's identity becomes or starts to be a little bit different from like men's identity, right? So the other club is called Club Femenino México Bello. It emerged as an effort to resurrect yet another club, el Club Cultural Recreativo México Bello, founded in 1924, which is actually 5 years before LULAC was founded. The club only admitted men, of course, and its focus was the integration into American culture without losing the connection to Mexican culture and identity. So these men, would get together to discuss literature, politics, music, all in Spanish, of course. And of course, the Señoras did not stay behind. They wanted stuff to do as well. So in 1936, Olivia Rosales y Piña founded the Mexico Bello Club for the wives of members of Club Mexico Bello. And at this point, if you're confused by all these club names, imagine what we went through in the archive trying to figure all of this out. But the point here of this women's club was to organize debutante balls and what we know as noches de gala. Later in the 50s, the Club Femenino México Bello would take over the organization of the annual quinceañera, open to all community members, not just the members of the organization. So before, in years prior, it was only open to members. And then later on, they started doing fundraising events and they started doing more open events that were for the entire community and not just for their members. This is very significant because not only were these like big fancy events often held at like the Rice Hotel, for example, which at the time and still now is quite fancy, quite expensive, right? But also because it highlights this prevalent feeling at the time that you need to present the Mexican American community as respectable and as capable also of having these big fancy events to display wealth, to display cultural capital, to create and forge their own identities, right? And so, as far as we can tell, Señora Cortes participated in Mexico Bello, both as a debutante and as an organizer of the later annual quinceañera. Her extensive social network as a young woman possibly had a role in helping her get a job, as we said before, and her clerical skills she developed at her job helped her keep these networks alive. So, based on all of her social participation, all of the skills she forged as a social señora, right, these helped her later on in her jobs too. As I mentioned, she was LULAC's national secretary for years, from 1955 to 1960, and then again in 66 and 67. She has very limited correspondence in her archive, but the letters that do exist show us how her social mentality was central in helping LULAC maintain its national network. So, for example, in one of these letters, she acknowledges that the organization's mailing system was not great. We keep forgetting about people. We keep not including people in our like mailing of the newsletter and stuff like that. And so she reveals that a lot of the keeping in touch with other organizations and even other LULAC chapters would happen through the secretaries. These women would get together at the national conventions to exchange information, update their mailing lists, organize future gatherings, etc., in a very social señora kind of way. So in a very direct way, I think that politics and relajo, fiesta, party, being social are very tied up in Señora Carmen's archive. So what do you all think now about like using parties for either for a political purpose or like what is something that we can learn from Señora Carmen's kind of brand of community building?
I feel like parties used for political purpose is like trademarked by like I don't know a specific community, but it's such a human thing to like use parties to your advantage beyond just like enjoying the company of others, right?
Like celebrations, like get together, because
Yeah.
not political parties, but parties for political purposes.
Yes.
Exactly.
It just feels like a classic move. And actually, like when you were talking about the Rice Hotel, we have learned along the way from various people about how LULAC, very tied up in this, held a dinner or a gala of some sort where John F. Kennedy came and talked to, like, one of the first sort of instances of a US president acknowledging a Hispanic organization. He got assassinated the next day. So, there's a lot of things happening around that. But that was also a gathering, a gala, a dinner with an express political purpose. And it just makes so much sense that like the secretaries of these mostly male organizations were the ones who were sort of making things happen, who were like booking the events at the Rice Hotel, right? Like picking those places, or like doing the work of like exchanging information, and sort of holding everything together. I don't think that's like new. I don't think it's gone away either. But it's just, I think Senora Carmen's brand of community building is not necessarily, I don't think it's as easy to see as like straightforward activism, but it was doing some really material work to like gather resources for the Magnolia community Houston.
Yeah, I mean, I keep, as both of y'all talk, I was remembering or thinking about Chicana Movidas, which is an academic book that kind of has a lot of scholars writing about Chicana women and their role in the Chicano movement behind the scenes. So definitely would recommend. We can put the citation in the episode notes. But yeah, that the contribution of that text is really to say, would the Chicano movement have been possible without all of the women doing administrative planning and cooking, all of those things behind the scenes? Like, the answer is probably not. Women were the ones reserving the spaces, cooking the meals, making sure that like there were like agendas printed, that like all of the notes were taken, all of these things that I think it's like labor that gets quote unquote relegated usually to people who are seen to have less power in a gathering. And so I just wanted to point this out because the power of having get-togethers for political purposes historically has kind of given women a central role in these kinds of things that goes unnoticed. So in the specific instance of Club Chapultepec, Club Mexico Bello, like all of these clubs, they originally trained young women to become part of society in a very gendered way, but it also gave young women an understanding of the reality of their society and how to maneuver it to get maybe what they wanted. And so if a social gathering is useful for a political purpose, which of course it is, then the people organizing that social gathering are essential to the political movings of a society, of a government, of a community. So in the end, I don't know if the people who are showing their face for political purposes are always the same people making the organizations and the plans behind that. And so I think that this is such an important way to understand social clubs at this time and in general, that especially because the social club world, or even like the hobby club world or the book club world or whatever, is always dominated by people who are not men usually. And so like you go back to kind of a more original version of that, or a historical version of that, and you realize, you know, there's a lot of power to be had there behind the scenes. I know at least, like, you know, my grandmother, she would constantly have everything ready to go for my grandfather's get-togethers. And you know, he was somebody who was a political figure at the time in Mexico, and she was always the person making sure that there was food, like that there was a space to be in, that, you know, people were comfortable, that people were happy, that whoever was appropriate to talk to my grandfather was there at like certain parties. And that was a big job, you know. I just have to cook meals for myself, my roommate, and my boyfriend, and that's already a lot of stuff. Okay. So thinking of having like all of that foresight, that's like a real person, like a real job. That's real labor. And all of these women did it like constantly without any kind of usually without any kind of, you know, recognition. I think that's like really admirable. And the fact that these social clubs were kind of a way to learn to do that was also kind of, I think, something that you can understand as a little bit feminist, because you know, if it's a female-led space, to show you as a young woman how to maneuver your society and how to gain power, or how to at least fit in a way that guarantees survival. That's, I think, pretty empowering. Even if it is kind of recreating the same gender norms, but to a certain extent, it would be difficult to suddenly do away with those as an individual or a small group of people, right?
I'd love to add to, and think as you were talking and as we've been having this conversation, and also your comment about turmoil. Sorry, I'm thinking like a million different things at once, but digging deeper into like this survival method by entrenching yourself in the structures that are sort of making up your growing metropolitan city of Houston, and these displays of, as you so rightly put it, Sophia, wealth and cultural capital. At this, like, to continue historicizing as we have been, in 1954, we had like the largest mass deportation of Mexican citizens following the removal of the Bracero program. And there was just, I think, a huge threat to Mexican immigrants and Mexican Americans who were also deported despite having their citizenship during the 1950s, and for many decades before that. And just this survival strategy of listing like all of your members and showing up to all of these events and showing yourself in public and being in public and becoming, you know, una persona conocida, feels like a real way of resisting, or at least just trying to survive this massive threat. And also the mass criminalization of people of Mexican descent at this time, who, this is like really when we started seeing the rhetoric around like a Mexican invasion and like immigrants are bad and criminals and dirty and gross. This is like coming right out of this period of time. And to me, this is just like a real reflex against that, trying to move differently. So we can critique it in a lot of ways for like its respectability politics, it's like play into class, and wealth capital. But I mean, truly, as Gabby's saying, it's a survival strategy.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you're bringing up the history of the Bracero program too during this time, because I think one of the things that I'm taking away from Señora Carmen's story and life and archive is this need to create that space of comfort, that space of relaxation and leisure, even if it is a class-based sort of like display of wealth and everything. But it's so important during this time period, precisely as you're saying, Sonia, like the acceptance of Mexican American people was often tied up to their labor contributions, right? Like, oh, we have the farm workers, or we have like the people who are laying down the train tracks or whatever. Like, we appreciate that labor. We don't appreciate the people, we're going to send them back. And for now, for the people who remain, as you're saying, Sonia, they're remaining visible. They're making themselves sort of like a statement, right? Like, I'm still here, and I also can have fun. My life does not just revolve around like work and labor and like doing stuff for people. Like, yes, it is a survival mechanism. It is like a way to present your self-identity, but it's also a way to say like, we're people and we also want to have fun.
Yeah, totally. There's also like power in numbers, right? So like grouping together by these clubs to have fun, but also to like show a sense of leisurely, like luxurious leisure in a way too. Yeah, it was powerful, I'm sure.
Mhm.
Still feels that way.
I'm also grateful for these social clubs because we have all these beautiful pictures
Oh yeah.
of women together, and I think that's really great because other than that, like a woman's life until a certain point in time was never recorded in that way that stays in the archive. And so it is kind of a feat to have an organization of women that gets recorded into posterity in an archive in such a tangible way.
Mhm.
And I'm assuming that the people who sort of like collected the documents and the pictures and the photographs to be included in the archive were probably also the women doing the administrative work, the clerical work, and all of these things, right? Like, I can't help but thinking about like the amount of like men's archives that only exist because of women, because women saw the value in like collecting works and like putting them together and like preserving them and stuff. So yeah.
Could I ask a clarifying question about some of this history?
Yeah.
Particularly the quinceañera. I think that is interesting. What was the annual quinceañera? Was it like actually a celebration of like young women turning 15, or were they using it like in a different way?
No, I think it was kind of like a debutante ball.
Oh, okay.
But like, whereas before in like the early 30s and stuff like that, they would just, call them debutante balls. I guess at some point they started like claiming that Mexican cultural trait and started
Ah,
calling them the quinceañera. But it was
interesting.
basically to introduce young women into society.
Thank you.
I think that's interesting too, of like, as the generations go on, you feel more empowered maybe to claim this word of quinceañera, of like claiming the Mexican heritage in a way. And I think we see this in a lot of different Señora stories where the closer you are to migration, the like more that assimilation seems to appeal to you because it is really more about survival. And then the farther you are from migration, the more liberated you feel to maybe try to find your Mexican roots in your life or to express that in a way because you don't feel so persecuted, maybe to try to assimilate. Obviously, this is a very blanket statement, but I think you see that here in this organization, right? Where you're like, okay, now it's time to say, like, we're really here, like, and we really want to stand out in a way and have the quinceañera instead of the debutante ball.
Is there anything else we want to say in relation to Señora Carmen or social señoras or the role of social clubs in shaping these these Mexican American communities?
It just seems kind of fun. It must have been fun. Like Gabby said, when we were looking at the archive, there's some really joyful pictures that came out of some of the archives for Cortes and Senora Cortes and some of the other señoras, like Estela Gomez, who were just able to find some pieces of happiness amidst like a real era of struggle.
I think actually that while going through Señora Cortes's archive, we found this one picture of her and her husband, and the husband is sort of like carrying her, lifting her up, and they're laughing and they're like having a beach day or something like that. And I think that that was one of the first moments where we started thinking about about Chicana joy and how moments of joyfulness make their way into the archive and what to do with them. And I think that, I mean, I can't help but think that maybe Señora Carmen was so like happy and comfortable in her own partnership because she was able to be, you know, to have a certain degree of independence and a certain degree of status within her community, right? Like her life was not just entirely revolving around like the man in the relationship, right? It was also geared towards this broader community that included her husband, that included all of her friends as well, right? Well, we have learned a lot from Señora Carmen's archive. We have learned a lot about social señoras. I hope that this is inspiring us all to just throw a party this weekend or something.
Yeah, do y'all want to come over?
Yes.
Coming over to Austin right now.
Gabby's getting in a
really
plane.
fast. No, I'm
Done.
running. I'm running
Oh,
from LA
okay.
to Austin. It's part of
Excellent.
being a social señora. You have to be energetic.
We'll have a list of attendees. We'll take notes.
Thank you again for joining us in this episode of Señora Power. Go throw a party. Bye.
Bye.